Meanwhile, new information shows the FBI used a controversial dossier of alleged contacts between President Trump and Russian agents as evidence for a secret surveillance warrant. Sources confirm to CBS News that the FBI obtained the dossier full of allegations that Russian intelligence has compromising information about the president. The dossier also claims the Russians had contacts with former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. The FBI later asked a judge for a warrant to monitor Page's communications. Page, meanwhile, denies any wrongdoing. And we want to welcome in Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He's the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Thanks for joining us, Congressman.
Good to be with you.
All right, so let's talk about this dossier. When we first heard about it, there was some discussion as to whether or not the content was even valid. Certainly salacious, very interesting stuff, but truthful, we didn't know. How important is this dossier, do you think?
Well, I'm very limited in what I can discuss on the particulars investigation, but certainly we have an interest in knowing what parts of the dossier are accurate or may be accurate, whether it's any of the dossier, much of the dossier, none of the dossier. So this is certainly something that we're investigating.
Right.
And obviously a lot of the allegations within the dossier go to issues of either coordination or collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, or the issue of potentially compromising material. Those general issues are very much within the scope of our investigation.
Now, the information in the dossier, as I understand it, was provided by a former British spy. But I think even the information that he received may have been secondhand. You want to speak to this former spy?
Yes, we would love to speak with Mr. Steele, and obviously whatever sources of information he would be willing to share with us, we would want to then talk with the sources if that was possible. You know, looking at the dossier, the surface of the dossier, it may be those sources are within Russia. They may or may not be willing to cooperate or feel it's safe for them to cooperate. But obviously we want to learn everything that we can.
You know, the Trump administration has been downplaying the role that Carter Page played, calling him a volunteer. Do you think he's a significant person in this investigation, and do you want to see him testify?
Well, you know, again, I'm very limited in what I can discuss about the particulars, particularly when it goes to specific individuals. But I think it's pretty clear he's one of the individuals that we would want to talk with at an appropriate time in our investigation. There's a lot of background work we need to do first before we have anyone that we might consider a precipient witness. We need to make sure we review all the documents. We want to hear what other witnesses have to say. We want to be prepared so that when people do come before the committee, we know the right questions to ask. So there's a lot of spade work that has to go in before any of the so-called precipient witnesses might come in. You
know, Devin Nunes stepped down, and now Congressman Mike Conaway is leading this investigation. I have two questions in regards to that. First off, how are things going?
You know, I think things are going well now. I think we're back on track. We went through certainly a difficult time with the chairman's visit to the White House and the documents and all that surrounded that. But we now have a new Republican lead. I think he's a very serious guy. We've had a number of, I think, very productive conversations since he took the reins. And I think that we're both determined to conduct this in as nonpartisan a manner as possible and follow the facts wherever they lead. So I think we're very much back on track.
You know, when the Senate Intelligence Committee started their hearing, the conversation was, now the adults are conducting a hearing. Now we're really going to get down to business. And I wondered how you felt when you heard that.
Well, you know, certainly I think all of us in the Intelligence Committee bridle at that idea. When we both began the investigation, I think we both began it in very similar fashion. Ours was blown up for a time when the chairman went to the White House, reviewed documents, then went back to the White House ostensibly to present the same information he reviewed at the White House. That cast a big cloud over our committee, and it caused a lot of infighting within the committee. But mostly it just brought discredit to the integrity of our investigation. Now that the chair has stepped aside and we have a new lead, I think we are back to where we had been. I think back on a parallel course with our Senate counterparts. And I think that makes us all feel much more comfortable, because we had fallen into some disrepute as a result of that visit, that evening visit the chair took to the White House.
I know that you feel like things are going much better. Do you think the public does?
Well, you know, I certainly hope so, because we have very limited resources to do this major investigation in both the House and Senate. Should either of the committees blow up and not be able to do its work, you basically half the resources going into the investigation. So we need both committees to be able to do their work. Ideally, frankly, we ought to do our work jointly as much as possible, because that has a multiplier effect on what we can do rather than each of us reinventing the same wheel. But I think the positive news of the last several days is that our investigation is now very much back on track.
And moving forward.
Yes.
Let's talk about the tensions with North Korea. Vice President Mike Pence has said all options are on the table. We don't know exactly what that means, but you can presume when you say all options are on the table, military intervention is part of that. But he's also repeatedly said that China has to do something. China has to play a role. China has to place more pressure on North Korea. One of the things that you said you'd like to see are sanctions on Chinese banks. You think it's a better option than what the current administration is suggesting?
Well, I do think the administration is right that China is the key here. But just asking China repeatedly, asking China nicely, asking China not so nicely, that's not going to get a different result from China. China will go through some of the motions of cutting off either coal or energy transactions with North Korea, but not enough to principally change North Korea's trajectory in terms of its nuclear program or its missile program. China is going to have to do a lot more. And how do we get China to do that? Well, I think we have to tell China, we're going to have to take certain steps if you don't.
Right.
And those steps are going to include a much stronger U.S. naval presence in the region, which you don't want to see, theater missile defense, which you don't want to see, and we're going to have to start imposing sanctions on those doing business with North Korea, not just North Korea itself, but those doing business with North Korea. And you're the one who does the most business with North Korea. They don't want to see that happen either. But if China doesn't act on its own, then we're going to have to force China's hand any way we can, because the alternative is a military confrontation with North Korea, which is fraught with so many perils. It ought to be avoided if there's any possible diplomatic alternative.
The conversation is often about whether or not China has the will. And that's really the sticking point. But could it be more than that? Does China actually have the ability? We're talking about a dictator here who doesn't seem to be bending to sanctions, to public pressure. Maybe China's not as influential as we might think.
Well, I do think, and it was interesting to hear the president say, wow, I was surprised to learn from the Chinese president they don't completely control what happens in North Korea. That is certainly true, and something he should have realized a long time ago. But they have more influence than anyone else, and we have to hope it's enough influence. At the end of the day, it may or may not be, but the bigger question at the moment is the lack of Chinese will to do enough about it. Now, the one thing that China will not support is a collapse of the regime, a unification of the Korean Peninsula under a Western-friendly government with U.S. troops effectively brought up to the Chinese border. So it obviously wants to avoid that contingency at all costs. That's probably the second worst case after a nuclear confrontation on the peninsula, which would be everybody's worst nightmare.
Right.
So there's a lot China can do short of a regime collapse. Whether that is still enough, there's no way of knowing, because the North may cling to its nuclear program to the very bitter end of the starvation of all its people, but we need to try to get the Chinese to do a lot more than they have if we have any hope of resolving this diplomatically.
You mentioned something that you thought the Chinese would not like, which is an increased naval presence in that area of the world, U.S. naval presence. And, the administration had certainly implied the other day that a U.S. Navy strike group was headed to the Sea of Japan. Turned out that ship was actually headed in the other direction, headed to do some exercises in Australia. I want to play some sound for you to listen to, and then we'll react afterwards.
You redirected Navy ships to go toward the Korean Peninsula. What are we doing right now in terms of North Korea?
You never know, do you? You never know. I don't want to talk about it. We are sending an armada, very powerful.
An armada. The president has certainly at times been used, let's say, casual language. But, your reaction when you hear talk like that?
Well, the president says you never know. Apparently, he didn't know because the carrier group was headed in the opposite direction. I mean, this is a problem. It is obviously a horrible embarrassment to the administration, but more than that, if he says there's a carrier group heading to the region and those words alone provoke the North into some military act and we don't have a carrier group there, that's a real problem. So the administration needs to get its act together, but more than that, it needs to be very careful about this saber rattling, because you have a young, erratic leader in the North that has a lot of weapons, both conventional, nuclear, chemical, that it can use to rain down a world of hurt on our troops in the region, on our allies in South Korea. And so we need to be very careful about provoking some kind of military confrontation.
Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you.